I'm Isabelle Gonthier, Chief Assessment Officer at PSI Services, and I invite you to delve deep into the world of testing with me. Every episode, I'll be on the virtual couch with experts from the testing industry, engaging in conversations about the latest developments in our field. Your quest for testing knowledge starts here. Well, welcome to this episode of the Tried and Tested podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about micro-credentials. And we have an amazing guest with us, Johnna Georgieva. She's a senior psychometrician and director of assessments at the Dental Assisting National Board. And we're here in Chicago together. Welcome to the podcast, Johnna.
Thank you, Isabelle. And thank you for coming to Chicago.
Yeah, always fun to come. And, we always say doing these podcasts in person just kind of adds a little bit of flair to it. So let's start with your story. It's always nice to hear about people's journey, how they got into assessment and credentialing. So what's your story, Johnna?
Yeah, it's kind of a circuitous story. I started out in a credentialing body, but they also did education. So I was on the education side and got to meet a lot of people there and ended up meeting the psychometrician on the other side of the house. And her and I just had an instant connection. And I ended up leaving that certification body and taking an admin job at Accenture. And about a year and a half later, she calls me and she's like, "Johnna?" Yes. And she said, "Are you looking for a job?" And we hadn't talked in a year and a half. And I said, I've kind of been thinking about moving on. And she's like, "I have a job for you. Do you want to be a psychometrician?" And I said, "A what?"
Yeah, what is that?
So that was before like Google and all that good stuff. So I just had to listen carefully. And she said, "I'm going to have you go take a weekend course." And so I took a weekend course at the University of Illinois, Chicago with Eb Smith and learned how to use WinSteps. Or I watched other people learn how to use WinSteps and my eyes just kept getting bigger and bigger. But I decided to go for it. And so she hired me as the manager of research and psychometric services at the American Society for Clinical Pathologists with no degree, nothing. And she had me sign up for the grad program at UIC. And so I started work in November, started my grad program in January. And that was the start of this magical profession that I have been in since then. I've been in here for over 20 years. I did go, she's still my mentor, Donna Tatum, and I asked her, I said, why me? Why did you pick me? What was it about me that drew you to me thinking that I would be a good psychometrician? She said, "You're organized."
Oh, okay. That's a starting point.
And she said, "Because of all the data management you end up having to do. Yeah. And so you have to keep track of so many things across so many programs and, files and clients. It's incredible the amount of data that you're handling and then, all the balls that end up being in the air." And so that was it. She said, "Because I was organized."
That is amazing. It's great because I like that story is amazing because it's like you got chosen and then you then added the layers, like the education while getting the experience all together in a very purposeful manner.
Right. Exactly. It did. It layered very well.
Wow, well, that's great because again, someone saw potential and opportunity. You kind of said, "Oh, let's dive in and let's see. Never say no."
Never say no. That's my mantra.
Exactly, I know that. Now let's just go with the yes, figure it out, learn, and it's great because look at you now in terms of like everything that you've done. You're extremely engaged with the industry. Yes. You were the president or chair of the ICE board. At one point in time, you've been very engaged across the accreditation standards, various kind of volunteers. So really engaged in giving your time to the industry.
Absolutely.
And parallel to that, a very busy job, obviously, with Danny as well, kind of running multiple exams and programs. So it's great to see your progression from that perspective.
Yes. It opened that door to where, not only could I build on my skills, but I built on my levels of responsibility within the certification world, at work and in my volunteer work.
Yeah. One thing that I want to say, just on the personal note, like I want to thank Johnna, because Johnna is the person that got me involved with the industry, and sort of like we worked together on the TAG, the Technical Advisory Group for the NCCA standard revisions back in 20. That started in 2012, and
Yeah.
you gave me the confidence and kind of said, "Hey, you can do so much more, Isabelle. Dive in," and I did, and thank you for that, because it's really important.
You're so welcome. You're so welcome. That was what's interesting to me is our different perspectives from that. I felt like you came in as the professional, like as the person that I was admiring. And I'm like, I want to be Isabelle when I grow up, because you have this presence. And I think that that's really important in our industry, is to have a presence and be able to communicate really well. And you enveloped me in your sunshine. You really did. And so I thought that you were mentoring me.
Well, there you go. We felt the mutual mentorship.
We really
This is
did.
awesome. But again, it speaks to our industry,
It
how
does.
people collaborate, get to work together,
Mhm.
and gain so much from those experiences.
Right.
Because you learn, even if you are an expert in your field, in what you do, as you contribute and get involved, you learn so much more. So I guess that's probably the perspective that we each had, because we
Mhm.
felt that we learned from each other's, we learned
Right.
from the process, we learned from the other great industry members that were engaged.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's great.
Absolutely.
I think it's great because it's almost like a good segue in terms of like the conversation we want to have about micro credentialing, lifelong learning, because those
Mhm.
industry engagements and working with other professionals are an illustration of that lifelong learning
Yes.
concept. But before we get into the lifelong learning, let's talk a little bit about micro credentialing. So there's more and more, like, it's funny because with micro credentialing, I feel like it gains in popularity, and then we kind of stop talking about it, and then it comes back, and it feels for many years we've been sort of dabbling with the
Mhm.
concept, but it is becoming a more important trend from a professional development standpoint, in
Mhm.
terms of considerations, because people are learning, acquiring knowledge, and gaining competence levels, and getting recognized in so many
Mhm.
different ways that are no longer like just a traditional linear pathway.
Mhm.
So, why do you think that macro credentialing is getting again some level of attention, and why is it kind of something that's interesting and important to consider from in the credentialing industry?
Well, I think that perhaps part of the resurgence is, in the beginning, we just wanted to define it. What's the definition of a micro credential? And I think we've all come to the conclusion that there isn't one definition of what it is. And I think that's kind of good. We're exploring the different avenues, how long it is, what types of technology are used. And now it's broadening to, it could be in any profession. And so I don't know that it needs a definition. We just know that it's smaller than whatever it is that we're comparing it against. For example, DAMI has a certification that has 3 modules, so 3 exams. So it's a multi hurdle. You have to pass each one of the exams. For 2 of them, if you pass those, you also get a certificate.
Mhm.
And that is recognized by regulatory bodies in the United States for individuals who are exposing themselves and patients to radiation.
Mm.
And so those 2 certificates could be considered a micro credential of the certification. So, that's a big example, because those are still based on a national job task analysis. But then when we start thinking smaller, because that's still the breadth of knowledge across the country, and it's not focused on a specific body of knowledge. And so I think that bringing it down to those more bite-sized pieces, the value of that is the accessibility, the flexibility. Individuals are thinking, you know, Perhaps they thought, I'm not a learner. I can't do this. I don't have time to go do it. And now micro-credentials, in whatever form they are, individuals have, more access to it, and really it's kind of exciting because you can see, "Oh, I'm gonna learn this," instead of, "I'm gonna learn the industry."
Yeah.
You can learn something about the industry. So I think that's why we're seeing more of a resurgence, and in that we relaxed our, narrow-mindedness on what is it.
Yeah, what is a credential and what do you need to do to gain a
Hmm.
credential? And I like that the concept of that you've mentioned around accessibility, which is really critical, and because it becomes a little less intimidating. Because
Right.
if you're looking at those modules, those pieces, like, oh yeah, I can do that. I can commit to this for now. And then once you get into it and said, oh, okay, what's next? And then you can get to the next one and to the next level. So it helps make it more manageable,
Hmm.
because depending on circumstances, people are not at the same place in their life, and it's committing to a long degree or a long process, might not be what suits you in that moment.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I definitely like that. Um, so, building on that, what are some of the key benefits of macro credentials, both for organizations that are offering them, but also for the individuals that are considering kind of looking at those micro credentials that might be available to them?
One thing that comes to mind immediately for me is actually a personal experience with it. And it's the benefit to myself and to the organization, AI with exam development. And at the last ICE exchange, half of the workshops were about AI, and a lot of it about item development. And, you walk into those rooms and you can create 2,000 items, and, the numbers just kept getting bigger and bigger. And individuals who don't really know item development are like, wow, we could, why do we need psychometricians and SMEs? We can just
Pump up those items.
yeah, exactly. And so, I started to get a little nervous, to be honest. And I was like, what am I going to do? Because I don't know a whole lot about AI. How am I going to ramp up? What is the expectation of my organization? What's the expectation of our credentialing association, ICE? The world. And so, it's like, oh my gosh, where do I fit now? And I read an article that said, and this is kind of a concept for organizations now, that instead of, oh, we don't have somebody who has AI expertise, we're going to go hire a bunch of people. You level up your staff and you
Mhm.
provide them with micro credentials so
Mhm.
that they can learn it. And then that increases the bandwidth of the organization of being able to take on new projects, because now they have new expertise on staff. But you don't have to let people go, hire new people. These micro credentials really can skill up your staff very quickly. And then you have these incredible metrics that you can look at and see, okay, is this helping people to perform well in their job? What are gaps? Maybe this department could also benefit from some AI micro credentialing education. And it's not as expensive as going to an in person course or
Yeah.
even an online
Oh,
1 week course. It doesn't take people away from their work for as long. And one thing, I've studied, procrastination. That was my dissertation. And so you learn a lot about learning and how to make things stick. And so one thing about learning is, you go to a class and you're in there, 4 hours a night for, 3 months, and you're learning, learning, learning. Sometimes it's hard for that to stick because it's so much information,
mhm.
and you can get through it and you can pass the test, but the moment you leave, that knowledge kind of leaves with you
Yep.
because it was the environment,
It's in
it
the
was the
moment.
pace. Yes,
Mhm.
exactly. The way I look at my micro-credentialing is, okay, I took a statistics class and wow, I don't really know what I know anymore. I could take a micro-credential on reliability and learn that and have the brain space to create those tags in my brain so that I can then apply that knowledge in future situations. Whereas, just having that mass amount of education, I I feel like you don't always learn what you need to know to do your job, and then you end up learning it on the job more than from the education.
Yeah.
And to take it a little bit further, I think that credentials can really be used to enhance that education.
Yeah.
So instead of removing that education, because where else are you going to get that body of knowledge? But then to enhance your own learning or as part of the course, those micro credentials could really be a key to advanced learning and advanced comfort in your expertise.
Yeah, so it's kind of like that upskilling that you're talking about, talent
Mhm.
development, professional development. So unpacking that a little bit more, like that whole concept of lifelong learning, it's always been a thing, but because of the more traditional structure from before, that concept of lifelong learning was very also traditional in a way, in terms of like as you whether you
Yes.
look at it in terms of lifelong learning or maintenance of certification or continued competence, so on and so forth. Now, the concept of micro credentials opens up for a more diversified way of, of building on that concept of lifelong learning and meeting people where they are at, and the
Mhm.
benefits to the organization to say, well, we're not getting stale. We're able to offer opportunities for upskilling, for development that are manageable, structured, and you're still getting the recognition because people love the pat on the back. So
Oh,
credentials allow for that. You
yes.
accomplish something, you get a badge,
Mhm.
you get a certificate, and you can then potentially also, you've mentioned, stack them to then
Mhm.
earn an actual credential. It's the possibilities are so,
Mhm.
there's so many opportunities with that.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think you mentioned this, briefly before, that you can pick what you want to learn, right? And so, maybe that's not my cup of tea, this reliability. I don't wanna learn about that, but I am interested in other parts of exam development. So I'm gonna go over here, and I'm gonna look at, job task analysis and how that works. And so you as an individual, especially, because individuals can now afford to pay for their own micro credentialing if they want to. So you're not waiting for that, that kind of a grant from your organization to help you pay for education that could be very expensive. And so whether your company is paying for it or you're like, you know what, I really want this other job. Maybe I'm in exam development, I'm a psychometrician, but I really want to be a coder, or, I want to do something in IT, but I don't want to tell my boss because I don't want my boss to think that I want to leave, but because maybe it's just for myself, my own
Your
knowledge, but
own
maybe I
development.
do want to see, a new career opportunity. I can take a step into it without a huge investment. And so I can learn about that. And you have to realize with a micro credential that it is not the full body of education that you would need to be that coder
Yeah.
in the IT department, but it can give me a leg up. And so if I did either want to learn more, I would kind of get the idea of what areas do I really like about this, and I could pursue those more. And then you were talking about that recognition. Well, it's not like I just went and read a book on my own,
Mhm.
because, who's gonna you would believe me, right? But an employer is gonna be like, "Where's the proof?"
Mhm.
And so now you have the proof.
Yeah.
And
What's
so
the application and the
yes,
demonstration of that
exactly.
knowledge, competency, attainment, basically?
Mhm.
And now a short break. Hello, tried and tested listeners and fellow testing enthusiasts. I'm Isabelle Gonthier, your guide through the fascinating world of credentialing. Each week, we dive deep with expert guests to explore the hottest topics in certification and licensure testing. If you're enjoying our journey through lifelong learning and innovation, take a moment to subscribe wherever you get your podcast. And if you know someone passionate about testing or curious about the latest testing trends, why not share this podcast with them? It might just be the inspiration they need. Thank you for tuning in and being part of our community. Remember, sharing knowledge is one of the best ways to grow our industry together. Keep listening. You've mentioned how micro credentials was sort of used in your own context and world as the director of assessment at Danby. How do you see the possibilities of applying that concept in other healthcare professions from a credentialing standpoint?
I think that it's ideal for healthcare because, the workforce shortage is real, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're experiencing it as patients and as clients of the healthcare industry, and individuals are, doing more with less. We've always heard that, but I think it's really getting real in healthcare that you're the expectation somebody leaves and through attrition they're not going to replace that position, and now you're responsible for maybe the geriatric floor and not just I don't think this would be the case, but pediatrics and geriatrics. How do you get skilled up for that?
Mm-hmm.
And instead of then that person who's still there leaving to go get the education or bringing in somebody brand new with that expertise in both areas already and then having to train them up and unfortunately let go your current staff, that person through the support of the hospital or clinic can get that education and be a productive member of the team in that space as well. And so it builds their confidence. It gives you more stability with your overall staff because there's probably boosted morale. People are happier at work because they're getting that support of these micro credentials that don't take too much time out of their day, or maybe they're required to do it after work.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you
Yeah.
put in your, 10, 12 hours, and then you're like, now I have to go to class because that's what it was like
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
us back in the
Exactly.
day.
Mm-hmm.
My program at UIC was all in person, all of it, 100%. So the first 4 years, every Monday through Thursday, I was in class for 4 hours a night, and I took summer classes. That's exhausting.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah.
And in that case, you really do rely on that on the job training. Well, in the example I provided, there isn't somebody to train you on the job necessarily. There's probably a supervisor, but you need to get as much information as quickly as possible. And that's one way that you can do that. And
Yeah.
so it's going to help with our workforce shortage. It's not going to replace the traditional education because, again, there is so much more to know. You might just learn maybe the soft skills in this micro credentialing. You're not going to learn, those hard skills where you're actually manipulating the patient. But you're going to be able to take some of that, those pieces and learn them really well. And then eventually, when things calm down, calm up, whatever's going on in our society right now, we'll be able to rely on the more traditional education to round out that person. But it should be able to help us fill some gaps right now, at least
Yeah.
initially.
Oh, absolutely. I think that you've mentioned, in the course of the conversation, the importance as well to be really clear in terms of what those micro credentials are. That they're not necessarily they're meant to cover a specific area, there's a clear
Mhm.
purpose for it. So when you think about the development of those micro credentials, how do you ensure that in a way to be clear on what the purpose is, what is it really meant to do, what it is assessing, and what when you earn a micro credential, what does it mean? But how do you, in the development of those micro credentials, how do you ensure that it to maintain the validity of the micro credential and thinking about the process, and the credibility, kind of making sure
Right.
it's credible.
It's a challenge.
Hmm.
I trust myself and I know, we have NCCA accredited programs. And so I would feel confident and my organization would feel confident that we could build quality and reliable micro credentials. You can use AI to create an entire micro credential, from beginning to end with, assessments and even, at least guidelines for hands-on, more application through technology. So the the information is out there on how to do it correctly, but not enough people will know that. And so, as a consumer, you're going to have to be very careful and rely on perhaps your professional organization. Maybe they are offering these micro credentials, or the certification body where you earned your certification. But you're going to have to do some investigation. They're not all created equal. And as we talked about initially, there isn't one definition. They're not standardized yet. I think in the future, they will need to become a little more standardized, like we have the accreditation guidelines. So even if you're not accredited, you can follow those and make sure that your program is using best practices.
Yeah.
But until then, we we will have to rely on our sleuthing skills, our social skills. I would contact I could contact ICE right now. I could send an email, a chat off to the listserv and say, hey, I'm looking to get upskilled in this area. Can somebody recommend a micro credential? And so there are a lot of ways that we can find the quality, but I wonder when we'll start to build those standards around that, because I think that will have to come, because as an investigator, like I know, my field, but investigating the quality of a micro credential and the company that's offering it may not be my area of expertise, and I might end up taking a course that is either it's just not of good quality, or it's they say one thing and it's another, kind of that switcheroo. You see that a lot on Facebook and YouTube. And
Oh yeah, there's so much different things, and then yeah, the quality could be absolutely variable. So researching a little bit more on what it is, how it was developed, how it was validated, and to build from it and understand what are you paying for, what are you getting, and what's going to be the value
Right,
for
right.
you. Yeah.
And, people throw around words like, accredited and certified. And, do we all really know what that means? And we, in our industry, it has a strong meaning. But from um, uh, other areas, so let's say an employer in a healthcare field wants to create his or her own micro credential, and they have no skill in it, but they'll say, this is accredited. You're going to get CE credits to apply to your, annual state licensure that's required. And you take it, and then you find out, no, it can't be used for that. And you've spent money, and hopefully it wasn't as much money as like a $15,000 course, but maybe it was a few $100s, and you leave with nothing and little recourse to get your money back, because they've already planned out how to combat anybody who comes and says that wasn't quality, that you said this and it wasn't that. And there are lots of accrediting bodies, but again, they have to be a quality accrediting body. What NCCA standards are accredited to ISO standards. There is a really, really great foundation that's already available, but I think that the consumers just don't know that. And so in our industry, we have to make sure that we are saying these things. Yes, micro credentials are here. How are we going to start standardizing them for recognition?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as you kind of look, and we've talked a bit about the benefits to the individuals. So, making sure you're getting the quality and benefits to the organization. Another element that I wanted to further discuss is as we think about that concept of upskillings, workforce development, how employers can actually leverage that. There's also the whole concept of portability. And we've talked about portability to be able to kind of leverage those micro credentials that are not necessarily just applicable in one context, in one workplace, but can help in terms of like opening doors. And we've talked about, the technical skills, but there's also, you've mentioned the soft skills, or what we can call them also durable skills.
Right.
That is a massive opportunity from a micro-credentialing standpoint, because those durable skills, talking about critical thinking, communication, problem solving, all of those elements can be applied, are skills that are cross-functional, cross-organizational, and then they can be applied in specific technical contexts. So I think
Yes.
that is also another opportunity. I think that concept is a little harder to define, because, how do you provide attestation of a certain skill set? But at the same time, I think we need to start thinking differently about how we develop and recognize those skills. So that's an opportunity as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, that'll be interesting to see, because we can't really test on soft skills. People try, and there was some success and some with little success. And so I think that the learning part is probably a really good way to support somebody upskilling in those durable skills. I like that term better. And the one thing that I could see where employers might be like, well, that doesn't really apply, is, we have specific procedures, like in a dental setting. You greet the patient, you seat the patient, you do, and so if there's no seating, then, well, that doesn't apply. But it's that durable part of it that you're learning those to recognize those good people skills, and learning how people react to that. And you don't always get that in a traditional education environment.
Yeah, because the focus is a little bit more on the technical aspects in a way.
Right.
I think where thinking about how we assess for those skills, I think that's where technology and the evolution of technology and AI can really help. Because in a more traditional setting, you're right, it's extremely difficult to assess those types of skills and recognize those skills. But I feel now looking at how there's much more applications where you can actually interact into like a much more learning base, but at the same time you can inject some levels of assessment and have a feedback loop in the process that brings us somewhere else. And that is also another opportunity from a micro-credentialing standpoint, the technical evolution that allows us to think about assessment differently.
Yeah. I like what you touched on there. So kind of the adaptive part of it, the adaptive learning, because right now most of it is going to be static, everybody's going to get the same thing. But with AI, the future could be where you're taking this course and it's assessing your skill, and you might be able to skip sections, or it might just completely tailor a new section for you. And that also, like maybe the high level of, yes, now I'm a coder is not my cup of tea, but I want to learn this much. And the AI will probably suss that out. And so it's like, okay, we're not going to take you down this path, but this is a path where you can learn something. So you're less defeated as an individual when you are taking a course and failing it. Instead, you could be taking a course that's tailoring it to you, and you do have success at the end. It may not be the same success that somebody else has, but that's okay. And so that ability to tailor it, because we love adaptive testing, right? And so the concept of adaptive learning and formative assessments, I don't think that the education uses those enough, but we know why. They don't have the financial resources. They don't have the staffing resources. Building them is very challenging, but that's where you learn, right? And that's where, so as the student, you're providing the data to show, have I learned this? And then the teacher goes, no, they haven't, or yes, you have. And then they can provide tailoring to an extent, because you've got 30 other students, And how can you really tailor for one individual? Well, if there's formative assessments built into this micro-credential and AI is assessing it, you're getting that kind of that formative assessment on the fly, and they can pinpoint, oh, you need a little more in this area, and they'll take you over here. And kind of traditionally, you'll take a micro-credential or maybe a small certificate, and you get a question wrong, and it will give you a link to go learn more if you didn't get it right. Who's clicking on that link?
Who knows?
Right, right. It's not required, and, then you're just reading something, and I think that that's really where micro-credentials and AI can take us, is that it's gonna be more of a continual learning process rather than stopping and bringing in more of our traditional mode of just reading something.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation, and I know we could potentially talk about it like many, many more hours.
Yes.
But as we wrap up this great conversation, what would you say? What would you want to highlight as opportunities or trends or innovations you would see that, as it relates to micro credentials and what it can bring to our industry, and any piece of advice based on your own experience in your organization or even in your own development?
I think we've touched on a lot of it during our conversation. So, the flexibility, I think, is going to increase. All of us have a different definition of bite size, but I think that's going to be kind of directed by the consumers. They're not going to buy the ones that are not bite size enough. And so that bite size learning, well, I think it will get not smaller and smaller, but more accessible. And so people will have more opportunities and more variety. I think that the use of these as data analytics to upskill your staff, but also as part of the hiring process. And so when you see resumes come in, I'm talking about paper resumes, right? Which don't exist anymore. I remember spraying mine with perfume and putting it in a pink envelope. So
The good old days.
the good old days. But that's a way to help you stand out, especially if maybe you don't have the traditional education yet in a certain area, but you're applying for jobs that might be slightly different and out of your career trajectory. And because sometimes if it's just a little off, people are like, well, you don't have any experience. But if you have some micro credentials that support it, that show you are willing to learn, because sometimes that's all it can prove, that you have the desire to learn more in that area. So those are a couple of areas. And then I think that we talked about standardization, and as that becomes stronger, we start to develop rubrics around that. I think that regulatory recognition is kind of the goal at the end for public protection, and you can. There's very little portability with like in the field of dental assisting for those bigger credentials, but maybe and states don't necessarily want to recognize those. Maybe they think they're either not necessary, or maybe it's too big of a hurdle to be a dental assistant who's in your mouth, who is doing very important functions, supporting somebody doing very important functions. But maybe micro credentials could actually, maybe they're a little more palatable, and maybe like an employer or a state board could start to recognize those. And then the higher regulatory bodies could come in and go, yeah, you know what, we feel a little more comfortable with these, but then they get attached to those certifications, because again, a micro credential is not a be all and end all of anything. And you can stack as many of those as you want together, but they're not going to tie together. Because traditional education is where you go, oh, this is how these all fit together and how I would use them within this certain job role. So I feel like they are. The future is here, but we're still kind of grasping with how are we going to use these, implement these, and recognize these. I also wanted to put just a quick plug in for not just lifelong learning, and maybe lifelong learning is scary for people. Like, can I just be a learner and I don't have to be a lifelong
It
learner?
doesn't have to have a timeline associated with
Right.
it.
I have to do this forever if I start.
Mhm.
But also just learning things that you want to learn
Yeah.
about, like, history, or I love to crochet and I love to cross stitch. There are micro credentials for those. And so, if you are really interested in learning, creative skills outside of your profession, there's a micro credential for that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of being open-minded to say
Yes.
it's not just about on the job or work related. There's just so many other applications. I love it. I think it's a great way to kind of say, let's open up the opportunities and perspective.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Johnna. It's been an amazing conversation again. And let's just kind of make sure we continue to talk about micro credentials.
Absolutely. Thank you, Isabelle.
Thank you.